Good evening. Welcome to the Riverside Church. I'm Reverend Kevin Van Hook, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Minister of Justice, Advocacy, and Change here at Riverside. And I just wanted to take a quick moment to welcome everyone into this sacred space this evening. We are honored to partner with the National Conference of Black Lawyers and several others for tonight's event. Here at Riverside, we are a church that believes that the time has come for us to work to change things that we can no longer accept. Here at Riverside, we are a church that believes that all of God's children must act as if it were possible to radically transform the world. We are a church that believes that our society can no longer depend on public amnesia. We are a church that believes that when walls are turned sideways, they can act as bridges. We are excited to have each and every one of you here with us tonight, and we certainly look forward to being with you, working side by side in the work that lies ahead. And so, without any further ado, we look forward to beginning tonight's program. Thank you.
Good evening, brothers and sisters. Welcome to our intergenerational conversation with Dr. Angela Davis and our panel, Vince Warren, Derecka Purnell, Amanda Alexander, and you'll hear a lot more about our panelist in just a moment. My name is Victor Good. I'm one of the co-chairs of tonight's event, along with Ifosa Akinzweya, a second-year law student at New York University School of Law. Unfortunately, he was unable to be with us this evening, so filling in for Ifosa tonight and introducing our program panelist is Paul Winston Kanje, a second-year law student at NYU and the Political Action Chair of the Black Allied Law Students Association. Tonight's event is an opportunity for dialogue among our panelists about the Black liberation struggles and lessons learned from veteran activists that might assist the work of a new generation of activists. But before we begin, I would like to thank the members of the New York City chapter of NCBL organizing committee that put this event together. They include Marlene Archer, Florence Morgan, Shirley Traylor, Paul Winston Kanje, Ifosa Akinzweya, Jonathan Davis, and Yvonne Lewis. I would also like to single out two members of our committee for special recognition. Annette Ainsley and Ann Mitchell have both been invaluable to our efforts. Neither Annette or Ann are lawyers, but both are longtime activists and found within NCBL a home for addressing the issues and causes that they care deeply about. And in keeping with NCBL's long tradition of partnering with social activists, organizers, as well as lawyers, they have been embraced as members just as they have embraced us with their dedication and invaluable contributions. In 1968, 17 black lawyers met in New York City and asked a very simple question. How could black lawyers, who had historically been relied on as a voice for justice in the black community, remain on the sidelines as those communities marched and fought for liberation and self-determination under the banner of black power? NCBL stood apart from the traditional black bar associations and from the mainstream organizations doing civil rights litigation. While we recognize the importance and the important role of those organizations, we decided that something different was needed. And so this small group of organizers wrote a declaration of concern and commitment. That was written 50 years ago, but I thought to begin this evening's program, it would be worthwhile revisiting some parts of that declaration of concern and commitment. And so I quote, Today, as virtually never before in our history, Black communities across the nation face a crisis of racism which threatens not merely our constitutional rights, but our homes, our safety, and our survival. The systemic suppression of Black people continues, notwithstanding the plethora of court decisions, civil rights laws, anti-poverty legislation, human relations commissions, enlarged political representation, and other symbolic promises to Blacks which serve as society's substitute for true equality. The Black Revolution, sparked by the growing realization that white America does not intend to deal with Black people in accordance with constitutional standards, presents the concerned Black lawyer with a question of the utmost serious nature, the answer to which necessitates a reevaluation of her role and her relationship to the Black community. To the extent that the Black Revolution calls for an attack on institutional and structural racism in this country, combating the crisis of the maladministration of justice and enlisting the total Black community in this effort for its mutual survival and uplift, we must make it. Where the revolution requires the development of unique and unorthodox legal remedies to ensure the effective implementation of the just demands of Black people for legal, economic, social security and protection, we must aid it. If the Black Revolution demands that Black attorneys organize for mutual exchange of plans and programs for a major effort to achieve dignity and a fair share of power, we must do it. And finally, if the Black Revolution requires that we provide a unified Black voice of resistance designed to unmask the silent but no less criminal conduct of American institutions which condone the suppression of Black people, the lynching of Black leaders, and the frustration of Black efforts to save Black people, we must join it. There is no existing institution of the legal profession as presently constituted available to address itself to the problem of white racism as it affects substantial justice for Black Americans in this country. For the above reasons, a National Conference of Black Lawyers on December 7, 1968 at Cappahosa, Virginia, firmly pledges to create a permanent and ongoing body of all Black lawyers determined to join the Black Revolution and committed to taking all steps necessary to assist Black people to attain the goals to which they are rightfully entitled by the most fundamental principles of law, morality, and justice. The National Conference of Black Lawyers was born out of the social conditions that dominated our consciousness 50 years ago. As we begin our conversation this evening, we hope to pass on some of the wisdom of those decades of experience to a new generation of legal activists. But we also hope to learn from them how similar or how different the social demands of today are, and how they might require new approaches and new methods. And finally, we hope to revitalize the National Conference of Black Lawyers to meet the challenges of this time, as our founders did in their time. And now I'd like to introduce you to Paul Winston Kanje, who will introduce this evening's panel.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us at this amazing event tonight. I am happy to be here representing NYU's Black Allied Law Student Association. The Black Law Student Association of Columbia and Fordham University Law Schools are co-sponsoring as well. It is truly an honor to introduce our moderator and presenters for this evening. Our moderator is Dr. Amanda Alexander. Dr. Alexander is the Executive Director of the Detroit Justice Center. The Detroit Justice Center is a movement lawyering organization that works alongside communities to create economic opportunities, transform the justice system, and promote equitable and just cities. Dr. Alexander has been working in social justice movements in South Africa, Detroit, and New York for over 15 years. We are so happy to have her here with us tonight. Our first presenter is attorney Derecka Purnell. She is a human rights lawyer, writer, and organizer. She helped build the leadership structure and political education program at Harvard Law School. She regularly provides legal assistance and trainings to community organizations working to end police violence or close prisons through an abolitionist framework. She served on the founding steering committee for Law for Black Lives. She has also been published in many journalistic publications and served as the editor-in-chief of the Harvard Journal of African American Public Policy. Next, we have Vincent Warren. He is the executive director of the Center for Constitutional Rights. He oversees the center's groundbreaking litigation and advocacy work. The center uses international and domestic law to hold governments and corporations accountable for their human rights abuses. Prior to his role as executive director, Vincent was a senior staff attorney with the ACLU, where he litigated civil rights cases focusing on affirmative action, racial profiling, and criminal justice reform. Lastly, we have the great Angela Davis. Dr. Davis needs no introduction. Through her activism and scholarship over many decades, Angela Davis has been deeply involved in social justice movements all over the world. Her work as an educator, both at the university level and in the larger public sphere, has always emphasized the importance of building communities of struggle for economic, racial, and gender justice. Dr. Davis has published 10 books and has lectured all over the world. She is now the Distinguished Professor Emerita of History of Consciousness at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Thank you to all our presenters for joining us tonight, and without further ado, I turn it over to Dr. Alexander.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you. It is really, really a joy and an honor to be up here and to be in conversation with all of you. I would say in this political moment, any political moment really, the worst thing that we could do is to not dream big enough or to demand big enough. So I'm excited for this conversation with three leaders who really embody radical imagination. We'll talk about the possibilities of this moment and what it means to do work that reaches across generations. As lawyers, we are trained to shoehorn really big questions of freedom and liberation into narrow claims of due process and equal protection. But our movements have always been good at using their full imaginations. So tonight is less about the law and more about questions of justice and power and having fidelity to our people's freedom dreams and holding them as sacred. I trust that tonight's conversation will give us all reason and inspiration to be bolder than ever. I have caught my courage from each of you over the years, so I'm excited for the alchemy of all of us in conversation together. Just a point about logistics, so we'll have about an hour for our conversation, and then we will open it up for audience questions. So there are two mics at either side, so be listening carefully, but also be formulating questions. So I will go ahead and get us started. So I wanted us to start by feeling our ancestors and our elders at our backs, and by honoring some of the people whose torches we are carrying in this work. So I'd love for each of you to talk about someone who brought you into the movement or who kept you in the movement. And what are some things that they taught you that you want to pass on to those of us working in the current climate?
What is this? What's happening right now? Oh, okay. Hi. Oh, thank you. Okay. All right, this is interesting. There we go. Thank you. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you to NCBL for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I have much to learn, even while I'm on stage, and I'm really excited to be here. So some of the people who have brought me into this movement and some of the people who've kept me there. Oh, man. So some of the people that immediately come to mind, like specific people, are organizers who helped to calm me down when I thought that I was being the radical that I thought I was being at the particular time. And I remember when I was in college, it was the first time that I tried to plan a rally. And this was for George Zimmerman's arrest after he murdered Trayvon Martin. And at that time, there were rallies going on all across the country, right? Going on all across the country for George Zimmerman's arrest. This is before I even heard the phrase police or prison abolition. So here I am organizing for someone to be in prison. And the event that we planned ends up getting a lot of attention. And I get an email from this organizer named Charlene Carruthers, who says, hey, I see you're planning this rally in Kansas City. You know, can we put it on our website? And I was like, of course. And then I realized I've never planned a rally before. So I was like, hey, Charlene, can I call you? Because I really don't know what to do, and now 1,000 people are coming. And she said, of course. So I just think of that as a very specific example of someone being present and available and willing to talk to me. And that was almost 10 years ago, and Charlene and I are friends now. But just having literally someone just to walk you through a very, very emotional space and teach you how to convene people, convene a rally, think about next steps. And I just think about it as a tangible example. I also think about people like Robin Kelley, who wrote Freedom Dreams, which is one of the books that I read in law school and completely changed my life. So before the Ferguson uprising happened, I was on my way to law school, and all of my furniture was being held at a public storage on West Florissant, where the uprising took place. So I had to get my belongings and drive to Cambridge to start law school. And I was hoping that a law school, you would think you would go there to learn about laws and justice and how to make change. But it wasn't in legal textbooks that I found direction and guidance. It was in books like Freedom Dreams and Abolition, Democracy, and Freedom is a Constant Struggle. It was in all these texts that were teaching me about the Black radical tradition and how we didn't have to, belong to establishment organizations in order to make change, but that there were Black people, people of color, who had radical roots and who were sometimes even dismissed as being certain kind of leftists, or sometimes, you sound like, a Bernie bro. Like these sort of ways that people shoot down actual Black radical leftists. And I started reading about Black organizers, Black socialists, Black communists, and I just saw them vision and struggle for a new way of being, and I was deeply attracted to that. And then the last set of people who have brought me into this movement and kept me in this movement were people who I was organizing with at Harvard, who were the dining service workers, the custodian workers, my students, and people like Amanda, who were a part of Law for Black Lives. And so these were people, despite this movement that was going on outside of the world, we were immediately thrown into some sort of an identity crisis, right? Because we were told that we were supposed to be the lawyers to save the day. And once we started to realize that that was not only, a bad assumption, it was just a lie. So we started to learn and struggle with, people who were at our schools who were the most easily marginalized and dismissed. And that was the dining service workers and the janitorial staff. And working with them and creating space where anyone could teach a class in an occupied space on campus, I started to learn, wow, this is the kind of world that we are actually fighting for. This is actually what democracy looks like. That this separate category between students and faculty, where people who were marginalized were not even given a space to teach and advocate, that's not something that we wanted to create. So being in Belinda Hall at HLS was being around a group of people who definitely kept me in the movement.
Thank you, Derecka. And I'm glad that you shouted out Charlene Crothers, who is starting the Chicago Center for Leadership and Transformation and seeding a lot more good work across the country. Dr. Davis, Vince.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Derecka. I really appreciate it. Listening to the individuals and the movements that have influenced you. And first of all, let me say it's really great to be here. Yeah. On this panel with Amanda and Vincent and Derecka, but also with you in the audience. And I have to tell you that before we came into the sanctuary, a small group of us met, and I saw people I haven't seen for decades. People who have definitely kept me in this movement, people who helped to save my life, because as I think Shirley Traylor pointed out, I was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. I think she said it in the context of the fact that I just recently got inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame. So she said, from the FBI's 10 most wanted list to the National Women's Hall of Fame. It took me a while to recognize what an influential role my own mother had played in my trajectory, as an activist. Because she was an activist. Her friend Dorothy Burnham and Louise Patterson, and I could evoke many more of that generation, Esther Jackson, Jim Jackson, and so forth. But thinking about that question, I realized that although many individuals have influenced me, too many for me to even begin to try to name now, that probably growing up in the South at that particular time made me feel an attraction to individuals and groups who were resisting and who were challenging the status quo and who were asking us to think differently about what was considered normal. And I think it's that sense of being a part of larger communities here and all over the world. I was a member of the Communist Party, and that was a period when you could go literally anywhere in the world and you could meet comrades who were a part of your community. Even though you had never known their names, you could make assumptions about the fact that they were all involved in the struggle to overturn capitalism. And even now, when I visit places I've never visited before, I was just in Uruguay not that long ago, and I met so many people who had been involved in the campaign to save my life. And I realized that I'm actually, however important I might be, it has absolutely nothing to do with who I am as an individual. It's not about me. It's about all of the people who came together during that time and saved my life. And so I like to think about communities. I really do. And I have to remind myself that the framework of individualism within which we are often compelled to express our ideas has been imposed on us. And we need to think in more capacious terms and think about people, think about the fact that if we want to understand who's really changed the world, it's largely people whose names will be forever lost to history. And so it's working class people, it's black people, it's people of color, it's people who've resisted gender oppression. And so that's why I think I am still a part of this movement. And one other thing, I don't want to take up too much time, but what's been exciting is to learn new things. And to recognize that the more we struggle, the more insights we accumulate, and therefore we have to shift the way we're thinking about the world and thinking about our struggle. And that once we were thinking about black liberation as a discrete movement, but now we recognize we cannot think about black liberation without at the same time thinking about the liberation of all the other peoples and communities and genders and also about the planet. We have to think about the movement for environmental justice. So I think that's why I'm still here. I'm trying to be here.
So I appreciate all of the offerings today, and it's a very emotional question, actually. Who brought you into the movement? Who holds you? Who keeps you here? And I think, Dr. Davis, you're right, that and also Derecka, that there's a combination of individual actions and communities and family that orients you towards this. And I've been thinking about the question, and this is just recently, it's the National Conference of Black Lawyers' 50th anniversary. As Victor Good was telling us. And the people that actually brought me into this work in terms of movements, not just in terms of lawyering, but in terms of movements, were actually people at the National Conference of Black Lawyers. There were people, I was come out of law school, and I was all full of spit and fire and knew all the stuff and knew all the things. But I was looking for a political home. One of the things that I learned from NCBL was that you can have all the lawyering skill in the world, but if you don't have political analysis, it's not worth anything. It's like, John Coltrane without a saxophone, or Beyonce without lemonade, or whatever. But the folks at NCBL really helped me and opened my mind and opened their hearts. Folks like, I can't mention everybody, but there are particular people, Florence Morgan, Annette Ensley, Lennox Hines, folks who really just took a chance on me as a younger person with a lot of energy that needed some political education and needed a home. And I have to tell you that it is a bit overwhelming to be on this stage, being invited by NCBL after having started so humbly in that wonderful organization. That this organization is holding this space and invites me back is really just overwhelming. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. So Dr. Davis, you, I think, opened up some questions of solidarity, across the Black liberation movement, but, fights around climate justice, around immigration, and seeing intersections between all of these. So I would love if, one or all of you would weigh in on this question of what are some of the most inspiring examples you see right now of kind of solidarity work happening, or work at the intersection of key issues.
Want to start again?
I would prefer not to start again.
Well, I think you're probably much more familiar with what's happening, especially
In terms of solidarity.
Especially among the younger generation.
Yeah, I think that one thing that has come out of the Black Lives Matter movement has been a very, very central focus on intersectionality. And I think that is borrowed from, obviously, Kimberly Crenshaw and the Combahee River Collective. And I think there's been a very deep commitment to, I would say, centering or bringing in the issues that are affecting people who are typically marginalized, right? And I think that's been absolutely beautiful. I think coming out of Ferguson, one thing that I realized is that how deeply committed our movement was to international struggles as well. And actually right now, I am having a little bit of a hard time. So just last summer, there was this gathering, this convening in South Africa of lawyers, academics, and journalists and organizers. And we were talking about this question of international solidarity. So what does solidarity mean? Does it mean that you're shouting out someone's organization at your event? Right? Does it mean that they get to co-sponsor it? Does it mean that when you are building a platform, you're weaving in, their particular issue or their particular struggle? Is it shared political education and debate and study? So we were trying to grapple with all these questions. And one of the, brilliant people at this convening, Mahanua El-Masri, is a radical human rights lawyer in Egypt. And a lot of her organizing and radical lawyering was around freeing women political prisoners in Egypt. And as of this morning, she's been kidnapped by the Egyptian government, her and 299 other people. So I'm in this WhatsApp thread trying to figure out how we're going to be in solidarity to get Mahanua out of prison. So it's just like, well, is this a hashtag? Are we writing letters? Shall I go to the embassy? The question of solidarity is hard because I think that in some ways, like you said, in the past, you could, see someone who identifies as a communist and you know that people are organizing around these particular ideologies or frameworks and ways of being. But now we are in this other space, and I'm curious if you see it the same way, where we are fortunate to be learning and adopting so many different types of radical ideologies, and we can lay claim to them. We can contest what it means. Like, what does it mean to be an abolitionist? If someone is identified as an abolitionist, how do we organize around that? But in terms of solidarity, at least, coming from, being a student at one point, solidarity meant that we shouted your organization names out at the event. Right, and and then we learned that, now we need to protest. And right now, I'm in a particular moment trying to figure out what does it mean to foster international solidarity with a comrade who's incarcerated. Mm-hmm. And it's hard, it's hard. So I was hoping to, get wisdom from you, Amanda and Vince, on how to move through particular, moments like this, how to move, where so many of us, it's easy for us to do hashtag free this person, but what does it mean to go to jails and try to get someone out, right? Those are the differences between, I would say, the past, and the present. Whereas now a lot of ways that people are showing solidarity is online and through media, and I think that's important and can function as an important channel, but does that then lend the same amount of pressure to physical presence and chanting, and yelling and demanding and showing up and base building? And so I think that we are in a bit of a learning curve when it comes to how to be in solidarity with people. And I think we have examples of when we do it well, but I think that we still have ways to go. Mm-hmm.
Solidarity is really complicated, the way we think about solidarity. And thank you for raising the very specific example of how we express solidarity across national borders, particularly around the case of someone who has been imprisoned by a repressive government. And I think international solidarity is so important especially for those of us who live in the United States of America, where no matter how progressive we are, no matter how radical we are, we've been affected or infected by the notion that because we live in the United States of America, somehow we're the center of the world. And everybody else has to revolve around what we do. And there are so many really interesting interesting movements and struggles happening in other places. I always think about the Kurdish struggle and the fact that we hardly ever talk about the fact that 40% of the Kurdish troops fighting ISIS are women, and about the fact that within the Kurdish movement, there has been this attention to gender issues that is far in advance of the work that we have done or are thinking about doing in this country. So, why is it that we don't know, what's happening in parts of Syria and in Turkey? Why has it taken so long to begin to develop a really powerful solidarity movement with people who are struggling in Palestine? And this is especially a question for New York. And we could go on. We could talk about the Rohingya and what's happening and our failure to respond to these really repressive developments in the world. But I also wanted to think about why it is that we make assumptions about work doing cross-racial work, and somehow or another that has to be about solidarity or about allies. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because we make assumptions about where our true community is, where we really belong. And that means that we don't think about the fact that where we truly belong might be in the world. And where we find our place might be so much broader and so much more capacious than what we are actually expected to imagine as the place where we belong. And some of us really don't belong in the communities where we think we belong. So I'm just saying this because, as someone who was trained in philosophy, I think it's always important to contest that which we assume is the most normal and natural way to think about things, because it's usually there that the problems really reside. We're just beginning to recognize how assumptions about gender have completely influenced the way in which we have tended to reject a broader, more capacious way of thinking about gender as a continuum and as not being expressed within binary terms. We're just now addressing that. And there's so many other areas. The disability rights movement. Why is it that some people are considered to be normal and some people are considered to be disabled? So I guess I answered the question about solidarity in a way that opens up a lot of other questions. But I think that's very productive to think in that way, because if we are trying to figure out how to express intersections, which you mentioned, and connections and relationalities, then we have to be open to those kinds of analyses.
Totally agree, Dr. Davis. particularly when we start off with how complicated solidarity is. And I think, listening to the conversation, we do practice in our work together a very transactional solidarity. It is the easiest thing for those of you who are in the nonprofit industrial complex. It is the most efficient thing. It is one in which a group can come to agreement on whether this other group is worthy of support, and there's debate and discussion, political and otherwise. But there's another way to look at it, which is one question around solidarity, of course, is the idea of really interrogating whether you believe that your liberation is bound up in the liberation of others. And if that is actually true, then the question is, what are you willing to give up? What are you willing to spend, not just in terms of finances, but in terms of your own emotional time, in terms of your energy, to be able to really build connection and make connection with people that are in common struggle, even though that they're not there. And that's a big challenge. It's a huge challenge in the context of social media and hashtags. Hashtags, as we know, have a life. Do they even use hashtags anymore? I'm old. I don't know. I'm the middle generation here, so y'all need to school me on that. But the idea is that they can take on a life of their own, and then after a point, they cease to represent what brought people together to begin with. And so almost that people are in service to the idea of the outcome of coming together, as opposed to being in service of being together and staying together and learning from it. So, I mean, at the Center for Constitutional Rights, and I've been there for now 13, 14 years, and it's been around for 50 years, but one of the things that's been clear has been the center has been a place where people can come and work, learn, teach, and partner in their own liberation. And so, many of you have been in the 6th floor of the CCR conference room where a lot of these ideas come together. But the idea is that it's not just creating a space, it's also what's the intervention. And so we have been very fortunate to open up our space, but I think open up and spending some time and resources and building with folks from around the world that are in common struggle. Folks just in the last month or so, people from Brazil, from Palestine, from South Africa, from a range of, from Pennsylvania, come to CCR, and we're in that common struggle together. But the idea is what can we build together? Not just what can we learn, but what can we build together? And that takes a lot of energy. I would say just one quick story, which is one of my favorite, which to me, when I think about solidarity, this is what it means. So you all remember in 2016 when what's-his-name won the election, and you all remember how you were feeling.
Won.
Yeah. When I say won, I mean, became president. And the day after that result, we had a case involving sexual minorities Uganda. We were challenging a US-based crazy guy that called himself an evangelical that essentially moved forward and instrumentalized criminalization of LGBT folks in Uganda. We had a hearing up in Massachusetts, Springfield, Massachusetts, the next day. A number of our comrades from Uganda were meeting us in Springfield. And so we get to Springfield, we have our oral argument, but we're just all feeling just so deeply, I don't know, torn up and destabilized by it. And one of our comrades from Uganda, Pepe Onziema, said to us in the meeting where we were supposed to be talking about here's what the legal situation is, Pepe stood up and talked to us and said, "We know how you're feeling. Welcome to how the rest of the world feels, but we got you." And so the idea that one of the most persecuted, criminalized groups in Uganda could be there for us in that moment taught me a lot about what solidarity really looks like in a non-transactional way.
Thank you. So I want to talk about abolition. Abolition is having a moment, a well-deserved moment, long coming. Across the country, organizers are fighting to either close jails or block the construction of new jails. These are not all abolitionist struggles, but they are working to close them in New York City, LA, Seattle, back home in Detroit, St. Louis, Baton Rouge, Atlanta. Across the country, we're having this moment where people are really rethinking jails. In these fights, we are so deeply indebted to your work, Dr. Davis, your foundational thinking about abolition. Your work has pushed us to stop taking prisons for granted and to understand that in order to get rid of prisons, we need to completely remake the society that produced prisons in the first place. And it's your work, the work of Dr. Ruthie Gilmore and others who have really pushed us to think about abolition not as an absence of jails, prisons, police, but as a presence of all the constellation of other institutions that we'll need to build out instead to make those things obsolete. So I'd like each of you to talk about what you see as promising examples of abolitionist work today. So who is really moving us closer to the horizon of abolition? Let's start with you, Dr. Davis.
Should I start?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you, Amanda, but I really can't take credit for this work. I can't.
Who should get credit?
The Attica brothers, for example. There's so many individuals and movements that are responsible for this critique of the criminal justice system. And I've just been very fortunate to have been in the right place at the right time to be influenced by those ideas. They're really not my ideas. And again, I totally appreciate what you said. But I also have to be critical of the way in which we often look for individuals.
Yeah.
And that prevents us from understanding how historical transformations happen as a result of the work that huge numbers of people do. Ever since the invention of these institutions we call jails and prisons. Sorry, I'm disconnected. Can you hear me?
No.
My batteries fell out.
Let's.
I want to speak into this room.
Thank you.
Batteries aren't in. Oh, good. Thanks. Oh, it was a simple question of putting the batteries in. Thank you. Ever since the invention of this repressive institution we call the prison, there have been critiques and there have been calls to abolish it. But it was especially around the late 60s and early 70s when a serious conversation about abolition began to develop. And I mentioned that when the Attica Rebellion took place, many of the brothers who participated in the rebellion were calling for the abolition of prisons. And it was taken seriously. If one looks at the New York Times during that period, there were articles and commentaries even by judges. The problem is that somehow the radical impact of abolition has been absorbed by the mainstream. And it has been turned into a call for the simple reform of jails and prisons. And I think we're witnessing that now with people even like Newt Gingrich some years ago who began to call for increased attention to the prison system and what did he call? What was the name of the organization? The Right on Crime. Yeah, right on crime. I guess that's what he was actually saying. But anyway, so I think that this myopic examination of the prison system and our tendency to even talk about it as only an issue of criminal justice allows us to be harnessed into a situation where it only becomes a question of dealing with jails and prisons, and we don't think about the larger context. We don't think about, what has happened in terms of the deterioration of education, and what is the relationship between labor struggles, and what is the connection with housing and education. And an abolitionist perspective really is an attempt to think about what we would need to, how we would need to change our entire worlds, our entire societies, in order to guarantee that we do not depend on the repressive work of the prison. What we've always said is, what would a society look like that no longer needs to rely on prisons? And unfortunately, we often forget that. And I think that right here in New York, Rikers should have been closed down. How long have we been making the demand to close down Rikers? And I think that the work that people are doing in this city are calling for not only the shutdown of Rikers, but no more jails. And in order to guarantee that we don't need no more jails, we have to attend to all of the issues that people unfortunately assume jails and prisons address. So that means that we have to talk about changing society. We have to talk about challenging capitalism. We have to talk about racial capitalism and all of the other issues that have been addressed by the various social movements that we are connected to. I think, did I answer the question?
You did. Derek, I know that you've thought about abolition quite a bit, or worked alongside folks who are thinking about, okay, what is it actually going to mean in practice to abolish police and to find other ways of caring for each other, for creating safety. Can you talk about some of that work?
Yeah, I think even, unfortunately, before we can talk about some of the presence for what an abolitionist future would look like, Rachel Herzing talks about abolition as a building up of individuals, communities, and institutions that allow human flourishing. And I love that definition. And I am nervous, I agree with you, that abolitionism has been absorbed into the mainstream, and people are not reimagining a future without prisons. They're reimagining mass incarceration. So if we're going to shut down one jail, we're going to open up 5 new ones, exactly. Right? If we are not going to have people in cages, we're going to lock them up in their homes, right? If even as people are pushing to reduce jails and prisons, you have mayors and even the federal government who's beefing up policing. So they're imagining a world where we're going to cut or end mass incarceration while either maintaining or increasing the size of police. Well, what are police going to do? What do police do every day? They put people in jails. So how are you going to keep 1 million plus law enforcement agents and cut and reduce the number of people incarcerated? Right? And then what I imagine is going to happen, and we've seen this already, is that police are being reimagined as social workers, as counselors, books and badges programs at my elementary school when I was a kid, right? These are the guardians of society. So police are being reimagined and reintegrated into all these other institutions if we don't think critically, or the ways in which they are being reduced, they're being replaced with what? With cameras and surveillance. So I'm nervous that while people are claiming even to end mass incarceration, even through a bipartisan effort or through a liberal impulse to, we can just reform the criminal justice system, we're going to keep building up a larger beast that's going to be much more invisible but much more integrated into our everyday lives. And that's what I'm really nervous about. Amanda, sorry, Dr. Alexander, formally. I was telling you, but this is, you literally earned it. I think it would be amazing, actually, if you talked about some of the work that the Detroit Justice Center is doing. Because I think it's an incredible model of how an organization can really, create space for imagine abolitionist futures and, speak to some of the alternatives that you asked me to talk about. I think that the work that you're doing is absolutely incredible, and I try to talk about it as much as I can.
It's very generous, Derecka.
But the truth.
At the Detroit Justice Center, we are working alongside communities and helping them imagine what we could be building instead of jails and prisons. So we are fighting a $500 million jail and youth jail in Detroit. And people think that I am joking when I say that Detroit is building a brand new jail because of all the other things that we could be building in this moment. And we convened a design summit last fall where we asked young people, what could we build instead that would make you feel valued and empowered? And not one of them said more jails or more police. And they said things like, build a mental health spa. What's a mental health spa? It's a place. This girl, she's about 12 years old, she said, a mental health spa is a place where you can go and you can get individual therapy and group therapy and talk through whatever is on your heart, whatever's making you anxious. And they had it designed down to what would be the most soothing paint colors on the walls. And they said we need restorative justice centers and interfaith cultural museums, regional transit. They said pay our teachers, fix the lead pipes in our schools. They had this whole list of things that we should be spending this $500 million on. And our work is also about piloting some of these things and making them real. So we are working right now with an organization called DLive, Detroit Life is Valuable Every Day. This is a hospital-based violence intervention program started by an incredible ER physician, Dr. Tolu Shinui. And he realized that he was patching up young people, so mostly young black men, 15 to 36, who were coming in with gunshot wounds, and he would patch them up and send them back out. And because he wasn't dealing with the underlying trauma, people would be re-injured within 3 or 4 months. And so he created this wrap-around holistic support program to deal with the PTSD of having been shot, but also of having grown up in their neighborhoods. And so they have not had anyone else be re-injured in that time. Wow. This is actually interrupting cycles of violence and incarceration. And we have a medical legal partnership with them. So if these young men also need warrants cleared or suspended license reinstated, we can support them around that. And we're creating supportive housing for them because some of them have nowhere to go when they're discharged from the hospital. So we're creating a space where they can heal. And so that's the type of thing that I think that we need to be building out. So this is addressing violence as a public health issue and addressing the underlying social determinants of health and building out a range of institutions that would hopefully interrupt these cycles of violence. So thank you, Derecka, for the invitation to talk about my people in Detroit. My team is doing some incredible things. So I want to...
Vincent.
Oh, Vince.
So...
Abolition.
Abolition. A couple of things. One is there's some amazing work that's happening. I think one of the most, amongst the very many inspiring things, the work that the Movement for Black Lives is doing, particularly around their invest-divest strategy, the idea of really thinking about what are we investing in and what should we be investing in, and let's divest in the things that oppress us, things like jails, like police, like prison, and let's really invest in what communities are asking for and what they're talking about. Just on the legal tip, there is, when I was mentioning earlier that we get visited from people as far away as Pennsylvania, the Abolitionist Law Center, the Amistad Law Project are really doing extraordinary work in Pennsylvania, partnering with the people on the inside and their family members to be able to design, I think, not just an exit strategy for people coming home, but also to really to think through in a more proactive way, what does the community need? And in some ways, talking to people on the inside about what the community they want to come back to that needs to be built, and talking to their family members who are tasked with holding them as they come back, and the community members is really it's a brilliant way to start, and I think particularly brilliant for legal and advocacy organizations to think in more like organizers and less like lawyers. And then I think the last thing I would just say, I was really struck by the idea of imagining. And just as an example from our Guantanamo work, when we've been representing Guantanamo detainees now, this is our 18th year. And when for every single client that we represent, every single lawyer that we've pulled together, that the project for us has not just been getting the men released from Guantanamo. The project has been ensuring that something like this can never get built again. And though I hadn't thought about it, in this conversation, I think I would like to think a little bit more about the idea of the sort of the 18-year-old prison that feels like it's been there forever in the past and feels like it'll be there forever in the future, and saying, this thing was constructed during our lifetimes. Everybody in this room was alive and kicking when this thing happened, and we are still alive and kicking now. And the question is, what's the opportunity for us to be thinking about how to build something so that these things will never be able to happen again?
Thank you. So I have one last question before we open it up to the audience. So Vince, you posed a question 4 years ago. We were right here and then right up the road at Columbia during Law for Black Lives. So this was a convening of over 800 lawyers, legal workers, and law students who came together to figure out how could we show up for the movement for Black Lives in this moment, alongside NCBL, alongside so many other attorneys in this work. And you posed a question to us that I have quoted many times, and that really landed with me. And you asked, 5 generations from now, what will Black people thank us for? It's a beautiful question because it really makes us stretch our imaginations and focus on the work that matters and that will last, and not just what is the easy win in the next election cycle. So I want to pose that to each of you. What is the work that we can be doing now that people 5 generations ahead just might thank us for? Vince, we'll start with you. Your question.
When I talk about that question, I think about 5 generations from now, what Black joy looks like. What that actually looks like in the context of the United States, as a people, as a group. I, as the middle generation, have never seen that. There are folks that are organizers now that come to this work saying and feeling that they are unapologetically Black, which is a beautiful innovation because I have never in my life felt unapologetic. And it might surprise some of you people. I am saddled with all of the things that people said about me, the internal narratives, the internalized racism, the internalized discrimination, and I'm trying to push forward, push out from that in all of the work that I'm doing and that we're doing together. And so I think that, my God, if we could envision an entire group of people that felt nothing but joy and possibility in their lives, it would be the most revolutionary, transformative thing that we can do. And things like being in solidarity with oppressed people, working internationally, particularly with respect to people in Palestine, undoing and rethinking the question of prisons, surfacing and supporting Black leadership, but particularly female leadership, trans leadership, queer leadership, not as an also-ran or as a me too or as a but-and, but as a central principle. Like the people that actually run and care for our community should be the ones that are leading the path forward. And so I think in addition to the work that we're thinking about, I actually think that centering new leadership in our movements right now and taking a risk on where that takes us is an extraordinary intervention that might actually lead us much closer to where we want to be 5 generations from now than sticking to the path that we currently have.
Thank you.
I'm really thinking deeply about what you just said, Vince, and I think I want to approach it somewhat differently, because I think pleasure and joy are so important in the way we build our movements. And, you know, people often thank me for all of my sacrifices. And I've said this many times. I mean, that's like what people say, thank you for your many sacrifices. And if I had the time to each one of those persons, I would say, but it hasn't all been about sacrifice. And it hasn't primarily been about sacrifice, because I have learned so much, and I have been able to experience so much pleasure in the process of being engaged in struggle. And I think that if we ask ourselves, what is the major contribution of people of African descent in this hemisphere to the world? And of course, we come up with the answer. It's this unrelenting struggle for freedom that has been unfolding over generations and centuries. But it's also been about music. And it's also been about allowing us to recognize that even as we struggle for a better world, we produce beauty, we produce joy, we produce pleasure. And I think sometimes we don't pay enough attention to the contributions that are made by artists and people who depend on the work of the imagination to do the work that they're doing. And increasingly, I think that is central. And I mean, I agree with you. I also want to do the work that will allow people 5 generations from now to experience pleasure and joy, but I also want it right now. I want it right now. And I think, you know, what is so remarkable about the Black struggle for freedom is that in the course of attempting to challenge racial capitalism and slavery and all of that these amazing possibilities of pleasure and joy have also been produced. And we can't forget that, because if we forget that, then it means that all we can imagine right now is sacrifices and more sacrifices. And then people get tired of sacrificing. You know, they want to feel good. They want to... and so I think it's so important to cultivate this generationality and this recognition that the work that we are doing at this moment is not just for ourselves. That's a capitalist idea, that there is this immediate profit available, or you know, people who do work in organizations that rely on foundation grants, they always are asked the questions, you know, what is the 5-year outcome? You know, what is the 1-year outcome or the 5? But they never get to ask the question, what is the 5-generation outcome of this work that you're doing? And that's what we're doing. We're trying to create an arena that will allow us to constantly energize ourselves and those who come after us to do the work, because it can't all be done in a generation. It can't be done in a year or 5 years, or it can't be done in a generation. And the very fact that we owe our presence here this evening to the work of people 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago. It's because of them that we are here today. So we ought to be able to imagine ourselves being spiritually present, over the years, the decades, the centuries. And we're part of those new generations. The only way we will be lost and the only way we will be forgotten is if we don't do the work. We don't do the work and have an experience of pleasure also right now. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, y'all are not going to believe this, but Dr. Davis stole my answer. Almost to the T, almost to the very last sentence.
I guess I learned.
Wow, it's unfair to have to. Now I got to go last. When I wanted to go last in the beginning, I couldn't go last, and now I have to go last. So I don't know, when I first heard the question, I heard 5 years. And so now I'm thinking 5 generations, and I'm like, wow, like 5 generations. And, fortunately, I knew my great-grandmother. She was born in 1918. And at one point in our family, when she was still alive, she didn't pass until I was in my 20s. We had 5 generations within our family, from her all the way to my 2 children. And I just remember her. I was the first in my family to go to college, and I remember her saying, she was born in 1918 in Arkansas, and just being like, wow, like, you're really gonna go to college. Like, for her, that was a very, 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 very big moment for her, for our legacy, for our family. And I think about my kids. I have 2 boys, Juice and Garvey, and the oldest boy is 5. And Juice, we went to go get manicures, and he decided that he wanted his nails painted blue. And for me, that was a huge jump for me. Right, because I'm raised in a pretty homophobic society, like everyone in this room. I'm used to gender binaries. I'm used to, even with all the progressive politics that I think that I espouse, like, here's my 5-year-old son saying he wanted blue nail polish. And I imagine that what my great-grandmother felt in terms of anxiety and joy about me being able to experience the world in a particular type of way. It was the first time I experienced that piece of that was when my kid, this boy, wanted nail polish. And while it was, for a lot of people in the shop were disgusted, they were angry, they shook their heads. The nail tech at first was just like, what? Like, no. And I was just like, why not? And I think about what that actually means for a kid who wants color paint on his nails to not be a big deal 5 generations from now. It's sad. It's sad. Oppression inhibits our ability to love because it induces unfortunate hate relationships that can result in attack, right? And physical violence and other sorts of legal violence, state-sanctioned violence. But what does it mean for the things that cause us so much anxiety today to not cause anxiety 5 generations from now, assuming that we still have a planet? So I think that the first thing they probably would like if we had a planet. But if the Earth is still here and all of the people in the 1%, like Elon Musk, are not on the moon, if Elon Musk's great-great-great-grandson are not on another planet and the rest of us are down here to live a toxic, hot fate, I would hope that people are free enough to think back to some of the struggles we have. It's so barbaric. Like, it's so barbaric. Like, y'all used to put people in cages? Like, really? Y'all used to have people with guns hand out ice cream cones to children? Because y'all, like, that's our reality right now. And I want it to seem so absurd. So when my great-grandmother tells me that white women who worked at the store would have to try on clothes for her, because she wasn't allowed into a dressing room. You know, me being 8 years old and being like, you couldn't try on your own clothes. I hope that the struggles we have today sound so absurd to us now. I see she stole my answer. I want it to be absurd to us now, but I hope that it has even more absurdity in the future because people are free to live, dream, and practice and solve other problems.
Thank you. Thank you, beautiful people. Let's go ahead and open it up. So we have the 2 mics here. I think we'll take maybe 3 or 4 questions. So could someone bring the mics to folks? Yeah, go ahead and come up, but I know if folks aren't able to come up to a mic, maybe we could have one that roves to someone. So yeah, I think we'll go ahead and try and get maybe the first 3 or 4 questions out there, and then we'll be able to answer what we can. So go ahead.
Yes. Dr. Davis, you talk about how we must decolonize our minds, and I was wondering if you could speak to how do we encourage other people to do that. Specifically, how do we reach people who tell you that you're talking about too much social justice or too much racial justice?
Thank you. So next, we'll take several at a time.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Are you gonna alternate?
Is it?
Go for it. Yeah.
Okay. So I had a question about Black mental health and organizing. And just for context, as far as where I'm coming from, I'm queer and non-binary and Black, and every space I'm in, I'm very obnoxiously Black. But I'm in this period where I'm taking a break from organizing, as if that's like really possible, because white supremacy is so pervasive. But I'm trying to figure out what my return to organizing is going to look like, as if I'm not 21, who cares if I come back, what that would look like, and having this, I don't know if it's realistic or not, idea that I'm going to come back not operating from a place of trauma constantly and actually operating from this place of just I want a better world, and not operating from just a place of constant pain. So just any type of, I guess, guidance on how to navigate being Black and that inherently being a traumatic experience, and then trying to organize and build this better world where that won't be the reality.
Thank you. Thanks. Let's head over here.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. I'd like for anyone on the panel to give me a little bit more clarity or your version on the difference between activism and organization. And the second part, I'm a part of Black Lives Matter Greater New York, and when you guys were speaking about thanking 5 generations down, our new president is a 19-year-old Hampton University young Black woman. And what we thought about was exactly what that question poses. How are we going to be perceived 5 years from now? So again, with the leadership that we have with our founder and chairperson, Hawk Newsom, we just thought it would be better for us as an organization, Black Lives Matter Greater New York, to start to bring in the youth and give them the tools, again, to continue the work that legends like yourselves have started. I appreciate you guys.
Thank you.
Hello. Sorry about that. I'm a member of No New Jails NYC and Take Back the Bronx. And thank you. My question is, recently Darren Walker of the Ford Foundation has come out in support of the replacement jails that Mayor Bill de Blasio is trying to build in New York City. So the question is, what should we do to combat this strong position that the Ford Foundation has taken to be so flagrant and outspoken to close Rikers Island and to build new jails? Thank you.
Okay, and that's going to be, I think, all of the questions that we'll have time for, because I know that there's going to be a brief closing remark, and then we have to be out of here right at 8:30. So that's it. Let's go ahead with those. So we have questions about responding to people who think you're working for too much social justice, questions about Black mental health, some of the pain and trauma of doing this work, distinction between activism and organization, and the question of the Ford Foundation's recent statement, Darren Walker's statement about nuance when it comes to closing Rikers Island.
Okay. Do you want to begin?
Sure, yes. So the question about what do you tell, I think that was addressed to you, Dr. Davis, but what do you tell people who say that you want too much social justice? Was that the question?
Yeah.
Yes. Right, I think it depends on the people. Right, so there are people who have no interest in racial justice who are going to tell you this racial justice stuff, you pull in the race card. I'm not going to say no names, but people like Candace Owens, for example, who are very interested in saying that, oh, all of this black stuff is made up, it's in their heads, what about black on black crime? So there are people like that who I take to be, usually the people who say this social justice stuff, and I don't respond to them. I laugh at them. I point my finger and laugh at them. I don't know if that's the most mature response, but I don't engage with people who aren't seriously engaged in struggle. The second category of people who I typically get some pushback from in terms of racial justice stuff are people who would otherwise be sympathetic to your struggle or your cause. I'm thinking about people, for example, from our hood who are used to community-based violence and see critiques of policing without having other alternatives, right? Who also share a critique of the police, right? Who say, well, what are we going to do? There's a racial justice movement. There's violence in my community right now today. And those people I am much more interested in having conversations with, either showing alternatives, expressing solidarity, and affirming their critique, and also acknowledging that I don't have all of the right answers. And then if I'm in another space with people who are organizing for racial justice and they say that this is too much, why are they there? I'm not really sure who these people are or their purpose there. But usually when I hear people say there's too much social movement happening, it typically falls in one of those two categories. And I am much more interested in working with people in the latter than the former.
Yeah, there's no such thing as too much justice. Too much justice. But I think you're right. There are people who say, yeah, we're in favor of human rights, but not human rights for the Palestinians, right? I mean, not too long ago, I was offered a human rights award in Birmingham, Alabama by the Birmingham Institute for Civil Rights, and then it...
For some civil rights.
Right. Well, I think the Institute is a really good thing. Mm-hmm. It was the governmental structure, the Board of Trustees representing the moneyed interests of Birmingham, who thought that human rights is really only human rights for maybe black people, and of course, well, maybe the Latinx population as well, and maybe a few people here and there, but definitely not for everybody. But in any event, that Board of Trustees is no longer exists as a result of the fact that people stood up in Birmingham. They stood up in Birmingham and they said that human rights for one, in order for it to be meaningful at all, means human rights for all, including the Palestinian people. So actually, I think I am going to go back to Birmingham because my mother volunteered to create that organization. It was my Sunday school teacher who had the idea that we needed an institute for civil rights, documenting the struggle. So, yeah, for those who say there's too much justice, ask them questions about the meaning of justice. Because of the fact that the current occupant of the, you know what I'm talking about. The current occupant is unused to engaging in intellectual discussion and has depressed the level of political discourse in this country. We cannot allow that to determine the way in which we talk to each other. And so I would suggest that, well, I think Derecka is right. There's some people who you just have to say, sorry, the next generation. So you move on. But there are others who are truly confused. And the best way, I think, is to ask questions, is not to say that, don't you know that this is the definition of justice. Just ask them, well, what does justice mean? How do you define justice? How can you define justice in a way that you can imagine too much justice existing in the world? And I think that, eventually maybe we'll learn how to engage in conversations that will be more productive. But it's so important, especially now, for those to say, well, I was talking about justice for black people. I wasn't talking about justice for gay and lesbian people. I was only talking about justice for black people. I wasn't talking about the fact that we need to stop using plastic because that is destroying the oceans. I was just talking about voting rights for black people or something like that. But to ask the questions that will expand people's ability to imagine justice and to do it in a way that allows them to come to their own conclusions, as opposed to hammering it into their heads. Because if you do that, they're just going to turn away. But if you make them really think, then, I think that's what we should be doing. That's what movements do. Movements are about re-educating our societies. Oh, these things never work for me. So good luck. Really, good luck.
Vince?
Yeah, I just want to connect with that. And particularly, I think a number of these questions can actually be answered in the context of Palestine, to be honest. And so one of the questions is, how do you get people that don't see it to see it? The second question is, once they see it, how do you get them to understand it? The third question is, how do you get them to do something about it? And the fourth question is, even if they're willing to do something on the down low, how do you get them to be out in the world about it? And those are different steps, and they are exhausting and they are tiring, but they are essentially important to the question of liberation. So you asked this great question, which is, how do you get people to shift their state? That is what we do. That is what Dr. Davis was saying. That is what movements do. That's the work that we're in. And with respect to trauma, I think it's connected there as well, which is, we do come from communities of trauma. We as humans live life with great joy and with great trauma always. And the work that we have chosen together brings that up, and it brings it up in very destructive ways. There are ways that you can lean into your anger, and there are ways that your anger can totally consume you and destroy you. One of the things about our movements is that it's not just about what we're fighting, it's about what we're building together. And, if Kathy Albiza is the head of National Economic Social Rights Initiative, a former CCR board member, said to me once, there are only two things in life that are worth doing: alleviating pain and creating joy. And I think that is actually true. And in the context then of working in solidarity with groups like the Palestinians in this country, on Facebook, in your community, at your dinner table, the question is really about, how can you shift the feelings that it brings up for you and transform them into feelings that other people can connect with. And it's a very hard thing, and we all can't do it. Sometimes we got to take a break. If you're in it and if you're getting burned out, get the heck out, but come back. Definitely come back, because we're going to need you, but you're not useful to yourself or to us if you are feeling some kind of way. But we need that energy. But I think, what I do is I think about how tough my day is, how tough the life is, how all of that kind of stuff. And then I think of the people that I've met in Palestine. And I think, what are they thinking of me right now? What is my trauma relative to the trauma that they're feeling? And I'm not trying to create hierarchies, but I am saying this. We in this room can turn it on and we can turn it off. That is a privilege. It's a gift. We shouldn't feel bad about it. You don't need to be up against it all the time. We can turn it on and turn it off. But if we can turn it off for self-preservation, and that makes us stronger, and we open up our minds to learn a little bit more, and then when we go back in with some clarity, with some homies, with a strategy, we're so much stronger than we were before. So I think particularly folks now, because I think I'm learning a lot about trauma and my own trauma, quite honestly, from folks that are bringing this analysis to our work. But I would say our collective trauma, we are big enough and strong enough to love each other deeply, deeply. And if we can do that, we can hold each other's trauma. We can excuse people when they need to step out, and we can support people when they need to step in.
Thank you. So thank you all again. I am really glad that questions of joy and pleasure came up. I think a lot about, in this work for freedom, what it means to also delight in each other's freedom and to know what it feels like to practice our own freedom. So I feel free all the time in my garden. I hope that each of you know what it feels like to feel free. Yeah.
To the question about the Ford Foundation.
Oh, the Ford, go for it, yeah. The Ford Foundation. And then someone from NCBL is going to come and close us out, right?
Yeah,
But yes, go for it.
I think it's really important to acknowledge the fact that people are thinking about responding to the announcement that the head of the Ford Foundation is in favor of the new jail solution here in New York. Our new, it's a series of new, pardon me?
8 to 12 new jails.
Each borough would get, oh, so you, yeah. And so instead of having one big Rikers, you would have 5 small Rikers, which would then probably eventually become as large as Rikers is today, because whenever, jails and prisons always become overcrowded. They always become overcrowded.
It's a mixed-use jail.
Oh, they want to build a shopping center. Well...
I told you we're reimagining mass incarceration.
Oh my God, yeah. See, this is why you need responses. You have to say, no, that's not going to get it. And I hope that people are, I know that Ford Fellows are thinking about how to respond, and there are Ford Fellows all over the country, right? I don't know, are there any Ford Fellows in the house? Wait, raise your hands. Okay, 1, 2, 3. What did you say?
Organizations funded by Ford.
Organizations funded by the Ford Foundation. How many of you have been active in organizations funded by Ford? So, yeah. About Ford Foundation? About the Ford Foundation?
No, I know that. So can you wrap up the point about the Ford Foundation and the next steps there?
I didn't want us to forget that the brother asked the question about how to respond to a very to a burning issue when a formation like Ford Foundation, which is known to have funded so many progressive organizations and scholars, legitimizes this effort to completely cancel out the impact of calling for the closing of Rikers Island. And, you know, maybe you all should, maybe somebody needs to organize some kind of a demonstration and go to, because the Fort building is right here in New York City, right? I mean, I've been there, and I would actually be willing to join. Absolutely. But thank you so much for raising the question.
Thank you.
And this is the kind of work that we will have to do if we want to continue to make abolitionist ideas available to masses of people in this country. We cannot say, okay. And I think Vince knows what that means when you try to shut down Guantanamo. And then how many years later is this?
18.
It's like, but we had a president also who said he was going to shut it down.
We did.
Well, I mean, I know we really miss him now, but but we can still be critical of the fact that the groundwork was not done to shut down Guantanamo. There's a connection between shutting down Guantanamo and shutting down Rikers. If you all manage to shut down Rikers Island in this city, the reverberations will be felt not only all over the country, but all over the world.
All right, let's get one last round of applause for this incredible panel.